Hi everyone, good morning and welcome to TIFF Bell Lightbox. My name is Teresa Scandifio. I'm the Director of Adult Learning here at TIFF. We're thrilled to welcome you to our fourth event of this higher learning season and the second event as part of the Real Heritage Initiative. In addition to those joining us in person, we have many others across Canada and beyond joining us via our live stream. Thank you all for supporting our higher learning program. Some thank yous. On behalf of TIFF, I'd like to thank our lead sponsor, Bell, our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oreal Paris, and Visa, and our major public supporters, the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, and the City of Toronto. We'd also like to thank donors and members for supporting TIFF's charitable mission of bringing the power of film to life 365 days a year, and also to the donors and members who come to events like this, who, yeah, I'm looking at you guys, phenomenal, love it. Thank you for joining us. A few reminders. No photo or video taking is permitted during the event. We do have professional cameras capturing at the event, and the video will be made available on the Higher Learning Digital Resource Hub. If you're sharing this event on social media, we ask that you use the hashtag #RealHeritage. During the Q&A, we ask that you please wait for the microphone to reach you before asking your question. We'll be taking questions for Christina via Twitter. You can submit your questions by using the Real Heritage hashtag. As I mentioned, today's event, The Materiality of Cinema, is part of the Real Heritage Initiative, an ongoing series of educational sessions dedicated to the access to and management of moving image collections in Ontario and beyond. Through panel discussions, workshops, film screenings, and networking sessions, the Real Heritage program brings together scholars, archivists, filmmakers, curators, and post-secondary students and faculty to examine the opportunities and challenges faced by both large moving image collections and small repositories, such as those found in regional archives and small libraries. We're excited to announce that all events as part of the Real Heritage program will be live streamed at tiff.net/realheritage. The Real Heritage program is supported by the Government of Ontario and the Ontario Trillium Foundation. Our next higher learning event is a panel discussion on April 2nd, which will consider notions of identity and citizenship featuring 3 Cuban women filmmakers and their short films. To learn more, please visit tiff.net/higherlearning or email hlf@tiff.net to request a ticket. Now, without further delay, please help me welcome the host for this event, one of my favorite people, who will introduce our guest expert, the director of TIFF's Film Reference Library, Sylvia Frank.
Welcome. Thanks so much for coming out today. This is the second in our Real Heritage series. I'm Sylvia Frank, and I'm the director of the Film Reference Library, which is on the 4th floor of this building. The library's role is to advance film scholarship through its extensive collections and staff expertise. Some of you may have already made use of some of our special collections, which include the archives of Adam Egoyan, David Cronenberg, Bruce MacDonald, Patricia Rozema, and that's just to name a few. We have about 85 special collections. And we're also the custodians of an extensive film collection. If you've not been to the library, please take the time today to visit us on the 4th floor if you have the chance. The library services are free to all, and as are many of the exhibitions that we also hold in the CIBC Canadian Film Gallery, which is attached to the library on the 4th floor. The aim of today's session is to examine the material history of film, of the film medium, by focusing on the tools of the motion picture handler and the value of proper training. The lecture will also be followed by a Q&A session that I hope you will take advantage of so that you can engage with our extremely knowledgeable guest, media archivist Christina Stewart. As an accompaniment to this illuminating lecture, Real Heritage will produce a how-to video with Christina Stewart demonstrating film handling practices and techniques. This video will appear on the Higher Learning Digital Resource Hub in the coming months, and we hope it will serve as a valuable resource for libraries, archives, and museums that retain film collections. So let me tell you a little bit about Christina. Christina has a background in media arts and is a graduate at the L. Jeffrey Selznick School of Film Preservation at George Eastman House in Rochester. She has worked with collections at the Canadian National Exhibition Archives, the Northeast Historic Film Archives, National Steinbeck Centre, and the Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Centre, in addition to the Warner Brothers Nitrate film collection held at George Eastman. So she has handled just about every possible type of film you can imagine. Christina has taught film identification and handling workshops through archival associations across Canada and is currently front-end manager at Niagara Custom Lab here in Toronto. So please welcome Christina. I think this is going to be very interesting.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome and thank you very much for coming out today, and thank you to Sylvia, Tiff, and Teresa. So we have a lot of ground to cover today. So let me start by explaining what I mean by the materiality of cinema. When I use this term, I am referring to the physical medium that carries and stores the images and sounds, and through which we experience the art form. So for today's purposes, we will be focusing exclusively on photochemical film. There's an aspect of materiality to digital cinematic objects, but that's a topic for a different lecture, and it's certainly not my specialty. So there's the physical medium of film centers on the actual film print itself, but includes a wide range of preprint elements, their techniques, special features, and tools used in conjunction with them, and by extension, even projectors, screens, and other artifacts that play a role in the viewing process. This material dimension has an existence of its own, independent of the film's content. As a communication medium, it is shaped by its history, some of which we will be covering today, as it relates to the technical characteristics such as base, emulsion, and gauge. More specifically, each individual film reel also reflects the evidence of its history throughout its life, and all these facets of the film print come together when the image is projected up on screen. So understanding the physical characteristics, the materiality of film, is absolutely critical for managing them as cultural heritage artifacts. But it goes deeper than that. The material dimension of cinema also has an impact on the aesthetic dimension. In other words, physical qualities of the medium have effects on our aesthetic experience. They interact with and become part of what we typically think of as content. The intangible qualities of the images on screen are created by the specifics of their source. Think of how film projection is different from digital projection as a blunt example. What this means is understanding materiality can add another layer to our understanding of cinema more broadly and open the door to deeper insights. It enriches our experience and makes us more aware of a film's history and fragility. But unfortunately, the technical details of the medium are often associated with a steep learning curve, and that has a tendency to deter people. To understand the materiality of cinema, we need to learn to see the images as physical objects. What we do today and what we're going to cover will help us recognize, identify, and read the unique features and characteristics of a film print. So whether you're a film studies scholar, a curator, an archivist, a film buff, this perspective can help enrich cinema for you. So, that said, the moving image has been with us for over 100 years. It has taken on many different shapes and sizes throughout its history before settling onto the standards that we know and use today. Film is a unique material, it's an organic material, it's a tactile material, and held in the proper environmental conditions, it's a very stable material. So as an archivist, I use the majority of my senses when assessing film prints or reels of film. Sense of sight goes without saying. We can watch the content, we can watch for damage of the content, but also we can see the different types of damage physically on the film as it's in front of us in our hands. Sense of hearing goes without saying. With soundtrack quality, we can hear damage in the soundtrack, but also we can hear the static building up on a polyester print as we're winding through it on a bench. We can also hear sticking adhesives or deteriorating emulsion as we're peeling it off, as on the bench as well. Touch, again, goes without saying, but the most important thing about touch, other than feeling for damage, is we feel for the thickness of the film, its flexibility or its inflexibility, whether it's brittle or not. And then our sense of smell plays a big important one because different film bases emit different odors due to the off-gassing of those film prints. So, because film is organic, it needs to off-gas, it needs to release and breathe, so to speak. Okay? So when you mention film preservation to people, they almost typically immediately think of black and white or color, commercially produced films that we see at film festivals or on television at like TCM. People don't usually think of the non-commercial films, which is what the majority is held in small collections and archives around the world. These include home movies, student and experimental films, films made for news broadcast, library films, kinescopes, just to name a few. But let's not forget that these films as well have played just an important part as a cultural object as those commercially made films. Okay. So, sorry about that. So let's talk about some gauge. When I use the term gauge, I'm referring to the size of the film, 35 millimeter, 16 millimeter, 8 millimeter, so forth. So let's start with our professional gauge here, professional format, 35 millimeter. It was developed 1892, not surprising. It became a standard in 1909. It has a vertical pull down, which means that the film is advanced in a vertical motion through the projector and through the film camera. It has 4 perforations per side of each frame, as you can see. As again, it's also the most widely used moving image film format. So when you go to the movies, unless you're going to go see a digital screening, you're going to see a 35 millimeter film being projected. 28 millimeter. So we don't use 28 millimeter anymore these days, but it's very important in conjunction with 35. So it was introduced in 1912 by Pathé Frères under the name Pathé Coq. It has 2 different distribution formats. We've got the North American format, where it has 3 perforations per side of the frame, and the European format, which has a 3-to-1 perforation ratio. So it's got 3 perforations on one side, 1 perforation on the other side. Library and Archives Canada has the largest collection in the world because Canada really latched on to this gauge. Ontario has a long history with this distribution format, so there's a greater tendency to find it in little pockets, in little collections here and there. It lost popularity in the mid to late 1920s due to Kodak's introduction of the 16 millimeter format. And so here's some images of 28. So on the ends, we've got the black and white and the yellow. You can see that's the European distribution format, the 3-to-1 perf ratio. And in the middle, on the aquamarine image, that's actually a 35 millimeter frame. You can see the 4 perforations per each side. And then the purple one just above it is 3 perforations. It looks very, very similar. And sometimes at a quick glance, it can be mistaken for 35 millimeter. So let's move on to 16. 16 was introduced, as I mentioned before, by Kodak in 1923. We've got 2 different types of perforation styles. We've got double perforation, so 1 perforation per each side of the frame. Because this film was introduced during the silent era, we didn't need to worry about putting a soundtrack on the film. But when sound came in, they had to put the soundtrack somewhere, so they got rid of one side of the perforations to put the soundtrack in that area. But even though, and we still use double and single perf today, double not as much, a film can still be silent on single perf print stock just because there's no soundtrack there. So Super 16 was introduced in 1971 by extending the image frame into that soundtrack area. Super 16 is usually primarily used as a camera negative stock, even though we can make Super 16 release prints. And both are still used today by filmmakers, student filmmakers, but unless you're going to a Super 16 film print, it's always finished off digitally. Here's some images. We got the double perf, the black and white on the side. We've got single perf with the soundtrack in the center. And this color negative image is of Super 16. As you can see, we've extended the image frame into that soundtrack area. Regular 8 and Super 8. So, as you can tell, we keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Regular 8 was introduced by Kodak in 1932 as an affordable alternative to 16 millimeter, because we're in the Depression era here, so Kodak still needed to generate some sales. So all you really need to do to have regular 8 is just slit 16 millimeter down the middle, which is why regular 8 still has the same perf size as 16 millimeter. So it's very economical on Kodak's part as well. Super 8 was introduced in 1965, and we still use it today. It is still heavily used. We deal with it every day on a daily basis at the lab. For the majority of Super 8's history, it's been a positive film, even though there's now negative film stocks available. Both regular and Super have perfs on one side of the frame, but regular 8 is not a dead format. It's coming back as double 8, which is fantastic to see because regular 8 is actually one of my favorite gauges to work with. So let's take a look at some of it. So this is kind of a busy screen, but you can see in the center bottom, you can see 16 perfs on regular 8, and then the teeny tiny perfs on Super 8. You can see it better here. So we basically have cut the perf size of the perfs for Super 8. So they're really tiny, which makes repairs on those perforations a little bit tedious sometimes, but it's all okay. So soundtracks. So usually sometimes when I bring up soundtracks, I hear like a lull or a moan. It's like, oh, no way. So, but soundtracks actually can be quite fun. And it's really, really interesting. So of course, silent is a type of soundtrack. There's just no sound present. And you'll find it listed with various terms, sometimes on film leaders or in cataloging databases or on film cans as mute or as MOS. But then with the arrival of sound, we got into our optical tracks. And there's two types of optical tracks. So there's variable density, which was the first type of optical track. It kind of looks like a barcode running down the side of the film print. And then we've got our variable area, which is our squiggly line optical tracks that we still use today. And then, but today we use, instead of silver tracks, which are very rare and now not standard at all, we have variable area, analog cyan, and magenta tracks. Magenta tracks not so much anymore, but it's still around. And then cyan tracks. And then magnetic, we can have full coat mag or mag stripe for 16. So full coat mag is basically, it's a full coating on the 35 millimeter or 16 millimeter stock. It almost looks, it's that brown color that looks like audio cassette tape or videotape. It has that look to it. So mag stripe is not used at all today because it was a secondary applied sound onto 16 millimeter. But there's slews of film prints with mag stripe around, so don't be surprised if you can come across it. Then, because I told you we weren't going to talk about digital, but digital sound is present on film prints. So we've got DTS, we've got Dolby Digital, and we've got SDDS. So let's take a look at some of these here. So it's kind of busy. So silent film, this great big colorful smoky image in the front is full frame silent, no sound whatsoever. And then with variable density, you can see the two black and white strips up there. We've got the variable density on the one side, it looks like a barcode. And then we got variable area. It came in the 1940s. Became more popular as the squiggly line, as you can see over here on the 16 mil print. And then on the very far side, that's an image of a 35 millimeter print. And it's very busy because there's only so much real estate on a piece of 35 millimeter film. So we've got to put the digital sound somewhere. And the next image helps us with that. So we've got our variable area track right here, our optical tracks, our stereo tracks. In between the perforations, we've got our Dolby Digital sound. You can see their trademark in the middle with the facing Ds. On the very edge, which is kind of poor placement for a soundtrack, but anyway, on the very edge we have our SDDS, which is a Sony proprietary track, not used too much today, but you could come across film prints that have it on it. And then you can see these tiny little white dots. those are our DTS track that helps sync the print to an external sound reader. That's not used too much today, but it is on film prints. So as you can see, we gotta put all that in somewhere. It's kind of fascinating, actually. So now let's get into some base. Okay, so the base is a type of stock. So we're going to start with nitrate. So nitrate's era was from the beginning, so 1892 roughly to around 1951. It's extremely transparent and flexible. It has fantastic edge markings and vertical tick marks. So nitrate film, if it's a Kodak product, will always say that it's nitrate film at regular intervals throughout the reel of film. But if that gets masked in some way, for some reason, like it's been stripped, the edge has been stripped off, we've got these vertical tick marks also as the second layer to identify that the film is actually a nitrate base. Nitrate is only found in 35 mil format, black and white, negs, positives, prints, and Technicolor positive prints. And some 17.5 mil track negatives. So Library and Archives Canada has the largest collection of nitrate in Canada. And there's also another little issue with nitrate, which it's its own special little thing in it, that it's flammable. So it is classified as a hazardous material. It's a flammable solid. But held under the proper environmental conditions, it's very stable. So usually when we talk about base, it's not something we can see on film. It's not something we can see projected up on screen. You just don't watch a movie and go, oh, that's safety film. You don't do that usually. But nitrate is a little bit different. You've probably heard people talk about the nitrate look. And I'm here to tell you that the nitrate look is real. It's actually quite fantastic because the film is transparent enough and it's loaded with silver salts. They kind of just sparkle off the screen at you. It really engulfs you and takes you in. And unfortunately, nitrate is not allowed to be projected in Canada, but nitrate can still be projected. And if you're in the mood for a little bit of a road trip, first weekend in May, the George Eastman House is holding an event called the Nitrate Picture Show. You can go down for the whole weekend, sit in a theater, bask in the glory of nitrate, or just go down and for a couple of movies and take it all in as well. And then you'll have that enriched experience where you just kind of go, oh my goodness. That said, let's move on to acetate. So acetate films were created as a direct response from political and the public outcry to numerous nitrate theater fires that killed a number of people, and particularly children. So therefore, this is why acetate is referred to as safety film, because when it gets hot or it's in a fire, it melts rather than ignites and burns. So because 35 millimeter nitrate release prints were starting to be phased out in 1950 and replaced by acetate release prints, and the phasing out of nitrate negatives started to be phased out in 51, and then finally by 1952, the switch to acetate neg stock and print stock was complete, even though except in China and Russia, where they held nitrate on until like the early 1960s. You can see nitrate from those places still around. So all early acetates are listed as safety film, as I mentioned, and this is pretty much just to state that it's not nitrate. You're actually going to be safe in your home projecting this with your small children. Everything's okay. And we identify base types by its name. Oh, it's an acetate. Oh, it's nitrate. That's kind of how we use it. Much like nitrate had the vertical tick marks, acetate has the horizontal tick marks. You can kind of sort of see them a little bit up there as another layer to identify that it's a safety film. And it's found in all gauges, stocks. It's everywhere. It's what we use today. That said, acetate has a family. And it is started in 1912. There's 3 types of acetates. There's diacetate, which started in 1912, and it went till about 1930. Early 16 millimeter and 28 millimeters are diacetate. So this is where we come into the 2835 realm as well, is because 28 has similar characteristics to nitrate in terms of film thickness, coloring techniques. So at a quick glance, it's often mistaken as nitrate, and so, oh my God, we gotta pitch it, when actually, no, you don't. So diacetate smells, we're going back to our sense of smell here for identification. It smells of camphor or mothballs, because camphor is one of the compounds used in creating the stock. So acetate proper comes in around 1930, lasts till about 1950. Most 16 mils, most regular 8s are on acetate proper stock. And now we're into our triacetate era. So everything today is triacetate, 35, 16, super 8, you name it. Lab elements are still used on acetate today, even though it's becoming harder and harder a little bit. Acetate and triacetate are susceptible to vinegar syndrome. We've all heard of vinegar syndrome, whereas diacetate is not. So acetate and triacetate have their bases as acetic acid, so it will smell like vinegar, hence the name, or rotten eggs or dirty socks. Not too good, not too nice, but it's a way of identifying the film if you just open up a can really quickly. So let's move on to Estar. Estar is polyester film commercially called Estar. It was developed in the 1950s, or actually 1940s, 30s, but didn't take off until the 1990s in North America due to acetate already being in production at Kodak, and so the switch from 35 nitrate was actually easier and more economical for Kodak. Can't blame them. It's thinner and more transparent than either nitrate or acetate. It has a greater resistance to mechanical damage, and it has a tensile strength, which is the key difference between acetate film, is that polyester doesn't tear easily. It doesn't break easily. You really have to cut it with some sharp instrument. Because camera stocks are still made on acetate, it's actually cheaper if your film jams in your camera to actually break the film rather than break the camera. And so Estar sometimes has issues with breaking key components of your equipment. So, and it is classified as a safety film, so it'll melt rather than ignite. Okay. So up until this point, we've really talked about things you can't really see on screen, except maybe that nitrate look. So now let's get into stuff we can see on film. So black and white. It's been around since the dawn of cinema. It's not used in much today, even though The Artist was made just a few years ago in black and white, and it was silent, and it was popular, and it won lots of Academy Awards. So it's still a viable medium. It has different grades for different dramatic looks, as we all know. Just think of the rich texture of film noirs. You know, you've got the dark streets. You've got, you know, the wet, shiny streets after a rain or something like that. But then we go to color. Now, color is a lecture all on its own, and I'm just going to skim the tip of the iceberg here. So it's been with us since the dawn of cinema. Ever since film has been around, people have been trying to figure out how to add color to it. So many different additive and subtractive color processes, color techniques have been tried, from hand stenciling, tinting and toning, lenticular color, Dufray color, hand Schlegel, 2-color Technicolor, all the way down to 3-strip Technicolor and glorious Technicolor. And then we get down to, finally, our bipack and tripack color negatives. So here we see toning up here for the cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and then we head over to Douglas Fairbanks over there with 2-strip Technicolor in the Black Pirate, and then we pop down over here for our 3-strip imbibition Technicolor, which is glorious Technicolor with Betty Grable and Pinup Girl. And then over here we've got some Gregory Peck and Lauren Bacall in Designing Women, and this was actually shot on color negative film. It's hard to imagine that color negative film has only really been with us since the 1950s. Before that, everything else was shot on black and white. And then color was either added or subtracted to it. So many different color processes with many different looks. And film archivists, we have to try not only to preserve the film itself, but actually to try and preserve the coloring techniques that were used to create these looks. It's not so easy anymore, is it? Which is why color can be hard. But we need to preserve those color techniques as best as we can for restoration purposes. We just can't duplicate them digitally. That is not how the first audiences, when these films were originally screened, were shown the print. Okay. Enough about color. So let's go into the apparatus of cinema. So projection speed. Since the arrival of sound, we run at 24 frames per second, which is fine. But prior to that, in the silent era, projection speeds were anywhere between 14 and 20 frames per second, and this was due to hand cranking of the projector and the movie camera. But with the arrival of sound, this actually caused serious damage to the reputation of silent cinema as being labeled as archaic or worthless or just old-fashioned, right? Because silent films were therefore run too fast. So everything on screen moved ridiculously fast, which prior to the introduction to sound could be used as an effect which was appropriate for, say, like Mack Sennett's Keystone Cops. We all know about that. But it is highly inappropriate for, say, a Lillian Gish drama. You know what I mean? But luckily, the art of silent cinema is being maintained by numerous film archives, archivists, silent film festivals, organizations, theaters such as the Lightbox, to help right those wrongs and provide a more definite, clear image of what the art of silent cinema actually is. But that said, slower frame rates are still common in use today in small gauge, with independent artists trying to do it for an effect of some kind, which is great. And then we have aspect ratios, how we're actually seeing this image being framed on screen. So there's a whole range, as you can see here, and the next image is a bit better. So we've got 1:3:3:1, which is our silent full frame aspect ratio. And then when sound came in, we needed to kind of shorten it down a little bit, make it a little bit smaller, because we've lost a bit of that frame by adding the soundtrack. So then we go to a 1:3:7:1 aspect ratio. But then in the 1950s, things start to change. We start to get wider screens. So we've got the European widescreen, we've got the American widescreen. We even go to, this is where we get CinemaScope with the 2:3:5:1 aspect ratio, very wide screen. And then it's almost like you take something too far, which is Cinerama, right? Which is a mind-boggling 2:7:7:1. It's basically, literally, a half circle. So imagine trying to catch everything with 3 screens kind of come together. So we went too far, even though it was a fantastic experience in the cinema, we kind of had to bring it back a little bit. So today we're at 2:3:9:1, which is fantastic. Okay. So now we're going to head back to our film strips, and we're going to look at some edge codes and edge markings. So as you've seen from some of the images previously, there's always some markings on the edge of the film. And depending on what type of manufacturer of that film stock is, depends on the code. So sometimes there's no code, a date code, sometimes there is. So they're actually a wonderful tool for us to learn even more about a particular reel of film. Information such as film manufacturer, location of manufacturer, base type, sometimes you get the stock number type, date code, frame number, key code, etc. There's tons of information on the sides of the film. And all this information is extremely useful for gaining the whole history of a particular film reel from the start of its creation. It not only provides clues to its start of its creation, but also clues to its deterioration, and therefore proper storage conditions that are needed to ensure its survival for the future. a little busy, but it's fun. So for the last part here, we get into damage. There's 3 types of damage that we can actually see projected. And I mentioned this briefly in the introduction about sometimes it kind of morphs into the content of the film, when actually it's actually on the physical object itself. So this is what we're going to start to read a film print based on the type of damage. But film doesn't have to be damaged, you know. It can be fantastic, it can be sparkling, it can be brand spanking new. So, but because film is organic, it's susceptible to biological damage. So mold, bugs, fungus feed off of the emulsion because it's like a gelatin soup to them. These organisms thrive in warm, wet, humid conditions. So mold and fungus are hazardous materials. So if you come across a film reel that kind of has a white powdery look to it, or some fungus, you want to be in a well-ventilated area, possibly wear a mask because you don't want those spores to become airborne and then you inhale them. And also it can be very easily transferred to a film that doesn't have mold, and then you just transferred the mold to something that wasn't moldy before, and it could possibly damage the film. So mold and fungus, as they eat their way through the emulsion, they leave etched patterns. And this is what we call etching because it almost looks like etched glass a little bit. And then bugs, being bugs, kind of burrow down in between the wines of the film. In this next image, so you can see it kind of looks like icing sugar to be specific. This can be carefully removed. Here's some image of etching. It basically feeds on the emulsion and it just kind of takes it away. And in this bottom image here, we've got little pockets. You can see these little pockets. And this might be a good instance where some bugs have gotten down. But bugs, being bugs, not very smart, they usually get stuck and then they die. And so especially if you have a film or a collection come in that was stored in, say, like a shed or a barn or a basement or an attic or something like that, don't be surprised if you come across a dead bug here and there, and they inevitably leave their mark. There you have it. Pick which bug you'd like that to be, and that's your bug. Okay. So let's move on to physical damage. So physical damage is caused by poor environmental conditions, which can lead to our last type of damage, which is mechanical damage. So shrinkage is the big deal here, because film base is primarily made up to 80 to 90% water. So because film is organic, over time not held in the proper environmental conditions, the film starts to shrink. And it shrinks at all different rates, so it makes it a little bit more tricky. But what's interesting is that it's the base that shrinks, not the emulsion, but the base takes the emulsion with it. You see what I'm saying? So a shrunk film run through a mechanical equipment can cause serious damage. This is where we get our pulled or torn perforations, or perforations just completely stripped off of the film, and we get a bunch of other damage we'll talk about when we get to mechanical damage. So, but because of shrinkage, we also come across warping. This is where a film has a tendency to turn and warp on itself, and it no longer lays flat. But then we have color fading. Color films fade due to unstable dyes or poor environmental conditions, or the combination of the two. Kodak films, we've all seen the Kodak pink. We all know what a magenta print looks like. But Kodak isn't the only one. Ansco films also tend to fade, but they tend to fade in a very different way from Kodak. Kodak fades layer by layer. Ansco can either just fade completely to nothing, or they fade to kind of like a muddy, kind of greeny, browny kind of color. And so for black and white films, they don't fade. What they do is they have oxidizing or mirroring issues caused by the silver salts lifting out of the emulsion and then tarnishing when they reach the air. It's much like what our silver jewelry or tea service or something, when it's left out too long, it starts to tarnish. It's the same effect on film. So you can get little brown spots going on. And here's an image of some shrinkage. So that's a shrinkage gauge. That's the equipment we use to measure shrinkage on a film. This image is of a still negative, but it's a great visual to kind of show you the base shrinking and taking that emulsion with it. And then we have a projector image over there. So it's the perforation. So when a film shrinks, the space between the perforations is what shrinks. And because projectors and all their steel parts don't shrink, we come at a bit of an imbalance here, which causes the claws in the projector to do a lot of damage. And then we've got the warping, the spoking over here. We've got color fading, and then the oxidizing over there with the silver salts lifting out, and the poor actress is feeling the pain over there. So that's kind of what it looks like. And then to our last type of damage, which is mechanical. So mechanical damage is caused when a shrunk film is run through any sort of mechanical device, a projector, a viewer, anything that has the potential to damage it. And this is caused by poor handling, so we come up with all different types of physical damage on the film. So we get edge and perf damage, we get pulled, torn perforations, we get tears on the film. Sometimes they're just small little nicks, little tears. Sometimes it's a complete break of the film. Film also jumps in gates. Sometimes we've all seen like a little bit of flutter on screen where it kind of goes in and out a little soft. That's where a shrunken film, not too shrunk, is being projected, and it's having a hard time kind of keeping up in the gate of the projector. Burn marks as well happen. Scratches because, you know, the film is dirty, there's dirt and oil on it, and it's run through a projector. So let's look at some damage here. So we've got burn marks. This is where the film just stops in the gate for some reason, and the light from the projector, the heat from that light in the projector just causes the film to kind of melt. We've all kind of seen that effect where sometimes it looks cool and sometimes it doesn't. And we got some scratching over here, splicing over there. And then we've got poor Mr. Channing over there with a big emulsion scratch. So it's interesting with emulsion scratches, especially on color film, is that you can actually see how deep that scratch is by noting the different color layers. So our color layers are yellow, cyan, magenta. So you can see a little bit of yellow, a little bit of cyan, and the bottom base layer there is magenta, and we can see some red. So we know that's a pretty deep scratch. So we gotta get that fixed. So and so that, in a very brief, condensed format, is the materiality of cinema. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christina. We're now going to open this up to a Q&A. And I believe there will be microphones handed to you if you have any questions. Should we just sit down over here? Okay, I don't see any. Yes.
Could you repeat the question for the audience?
I can repeat it. I'll paraphrase. He would like to know if there are different types of emulsion, so a little more description about emulsion itself.
Okay, so yes, there are different types of emulsion, and it's all based on the type of film. So we've got different types of color emulsion, we've got different types of black and white emulsion, and this all goes to the sensitivity of, say, a certain type of film stock, a certain type of ASA for that film, different lighting conditions for that film. So so yes, there are different types of emulsion. Does that answer your question? Yeah, so the silver salts are in emulsion. They're more predominantly in black and white films. But, so yes.
Yes, over here.
Hi, thanks. That was a wonderful lecture. I was just wondering, a lot of people have been talking about the death of cinema and photochemical film dying, and then people say it's still very much alive. Other people say it's going to be gone in a few years. I wonder what your thoughts were about that.
Being a film archivist, I see the future of film as being very bright. There is talk about it. A lot of people are saying film is dead. Film is not dead. It is a very vibrant format that is still heavily in use today. Granted, not as much as it was in years past. But I think with the new pact between Kodak and the studios, we'll actually see more films being shot on film, which is fantastic. So we'll still have our digital projection for the release side of things, but I think shooting on film will be here for years to come. Especially that's for 35. Students and independent filmmakers are still using 16. They're still learning how to shoot on film, which is fantastic because it has a different component and different teaching element to teaching how to shoot something digitally. It's not necessarily a point and click, a point and shoot sort of medium. So yes, and seeing what comes through the lab on a daily basis, it is not dead by any stretch of the mean. So there you have it.
Over here.
Yes, thank you for the lecture. Is there anything being done to rehydrate films that have shrunk? Is there any way you can rebathe them? And
Yes, there are techniques that you can to do that. Usually it's a one-shot type of deal, and it's not. Sometimes it's not necessarily archival. So you can rehydrate a film through many different techniques, whether it's, if you got the time, you can possibly use eucalyptus oil or camphor to kind of help rehydrate it a bit. That takes months. Or you can, there's products on the market that you can use. But again, it's almost like a one pass. You've got one shot at it, because once you've used that technique to get your films possibly transferred, which is why you would need to do it, the film will revert back to what it was before the treatment. And sometimes, because it's not archival and we don't know the longevity of that archival, what's going to happen with those chemicals, that it can sometimes revert back to a lesser state than what it was before the technique was used, based on the chemicals in that particular chemistry that you're using.
in the heyday of film, for slides and still photography, there was a process. There was a company in New York City that would soak slide film in a resin bath that would replace the moisture in the film with this resin and give it a much longer shelf life, much longer, sort of more archival, and then they would laminate the film to glass. Is there anything like that being done with film?
It has been tried. So there has been attempts to physically remove, like you said, the emulsion, because the emulsion doesn't shrink, right? It's the base that shrinks and takes the emulsion with it. So of painstakingly trying to lift the emulsion off of the base and then reapply it, which for still photography, it's a very labor-intensive process. But imagine what it would be like for a 1,000-foot reel of film. So from a cost perspective, it's not necessarily cost-effective to do that.
Now, this wasn't removing the emulsion from the base. It was actually soaking the entire film so that there would be an interchange between the fluid that it was being soaked in, and the water would precipitate out of the base,
Okay.
and then the resin would impregnate the base and
Okay.
replace it so that the film would become more stable.
Okay, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. No, there's nothing like that with moving image happening,
Thank you.
to my knowledge, at all.
Three different things. One is, we'll say a stage that happened in the 1950s. It was very brief somewhere down in the United States, but they had gases emanating from the floor, and the rays of the movie would pass through these gases and make the people almost like 3D. And like I say, it was very realistic, and that's about the only time I ever read about it. And for whatever reason, like I say, never succeeded. Another was some years ago in the far north, the Yukon or Northwest Territories, they found a lot of film had been dumped into the snow, and the only reels, this or that picture, but apparently they were quite intact thanks to the intense cold that the films were buried in. And the last one was a Canadian director, Nitrate, was very upset about the colorization of black and white films that was going on back around about 30 years ago. And he was at a question and answer period. And we just saw a few scenes from the Cane Mutiny, which he had directed. And I said to him, gee, that looked like it just came out yesterday. But he was very upset about the colorization. And I said, you've been around a long time. You worked with a lot of actors and made a lot of black and white films. I said, if you can get these people to use their prestige and help you to stop this colorization before it gets too white, because he thought it was just damaging to whatever film is being applied to.
Thank you very much for that. I'd never heard of actually the smoke vapor thing passing in front of gases. Oh, okay, I'd never heard of that, but maybe it was because it was very short. It was one of those. Oh, what were they called? I'm blanking on the name. Those like Tingler films, like gimmick sort of thing to get people away from their new television sets in the 1950s, right? To get them back into the theaters. So maybe it was something like that. So that would be actually kind of fun and fantastic to watch, actually. Yes.
I have a question about edge coding, you called it, and having worked as a film editor and a negative matcher in the 70s, edge numbering was crucial to what we did. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, about taking camera negative and matching that to create what's finally the release print, and the way the edge numbers were essential to that. I mean, we couldn't have done it without the edge numbering.
Right. So, so as I mentioned before, you've got frame numbers. So each frame would have a number, and so and now we use key codes because everything's going into digitally. So for editing process, if you're editing on film, which isn't really done much anymore, we're all into digital intermediates now. But for editing on film, like you said, it was absolutely critical to know where to make the cut, right? And then to kind of, so you would have so this kind of goes into more production chain from a laboratory standpoint. So you have your original camera negative, and you have to assemble your final film. So from your camera negative, you would make your work prints, and then from your work prints, you would go maybe to your dupe neg. So you basically go negative, pause, you don't really go negative, pause. You kind of have to go back and forth between the two. And so does that kind of answer your question?
Way back in the old days, and the way that whole process worked, and the reason that there had to be A-B rolls, because
Yes.
every time there was a splice, there had to be an overlap.
There was an overlap.
and-
So
yeah.
yeah, which comes into A and B, C and D, sometimes E and F rolls, for editing processes. Just for that, I'm not a film editor, but I know I can recognize edge numbers and their importance, and we can actually look at where an edge number is, and we can correlate it to say a work print or a dupe print or something to that nature. So I hope that answers your question, but it is pretty cool.
Thank you for the lecture. Can you tell us a little bit about how you utilize the expertise that you discussed on a day-to-day basis at the lab, and maybe how many projects you're working on at one time, and maybe some of the projects or challenges that you're really proud of past films you've restored or worked on that you really stand out throughout your career?
So I use my archival training every day at the lab, because there's actually a difference to film handling from an archival standpoint, to a filmmaker standpoint, to a lab standpoint. All of those handle film in a different way. So at the lab, sometimes being trained as an archivist, and we review this, and oh my gosh, you take your time. Well, in a lab setting, sometimes you just don't have the time, and you just kind of got to get the film together, and because you got the client on the phone, and they want to pick it up in 2 hours, and it just came off the machine, and oh my gosh. So when I'm, say, breaking down a reel of film that has just come off the machine, and splicing head and tail leaders, I take the time to only handle the edges of the film. I don't put my thumbprint on it. I do my best not to handle the film in any other way other than on the edges, which can be a bit tricky when you're splicing film, right? And because you can't splice film with gloves on your hands, because then you leave the cotton fibers from your gloves on the tape, and then that's transferred onto the film. So, your hands are clean, stuff like that. So, and also it goes into talking to the clients, because when I'm at my setup bench and I'm handling the films, I'm breaking them down, I'm prepping them for transfer, I'm getting a print ready, what have you, my bench is in the front office. So when you come into Niagara Custom Lab, you actually see my bench. And a lot of people sometimes come in and they're not expecting to actually see the film on a reel right there. And so it's a great starting point to a conversation, because sometimes people come in, they're new to film, they don't really understand the nuances, and then they're like, they don't know how to handle it. They don't know the tangibility of it. It's just like, oh my God, it's real. And so it also goes into like a little bit of a learning, talk up the film. This is what it is. This is what I'm doing. And so it's fantastic from that point of view as well. So teaching people kind of a little bit of here and there to kind of get them a little bit more interested in thinking about film, because film is different from digital, right? So that whole knowledge of how to handle it, how to look at it, how to even shoot it, we're slowly losing it. So it's fantastic to talk about, because people are fascinated. They're like, oh my goodness, So there you have it.
Other questions? Yes.
Yes, I'm interested to know about film cleaning. I have lots of films at home that I want to clean, and I've heard of DIY methods from WD-40 to Armor All to professional stuff like Film Guard. And I'd like to know what is commercially available, or what do you use right now to clean film?
Well, it's almost the type of cleaning technique that you would use is almost on a case-by-case basis, depending on the type of film you have in front of you and how dirty it is and what needs to be done. It can be something as simple as a dry clean with just a piece of crushed velvet, and you're holding it very lightly and you're just winding it through, all the way to an ultrasonic cleaner when we clean release prints, or we clean a neg before it goes in for printing. There's also, like you said, Film Guard that you can use. But mostly you would use those on a frame-by-frame basis. You would use them very locally. So you wouldn't just kind of bathe your film in, you know, a tub of film guard, even though some people I've heard do that. But very locally with a Q-tip, even 99% alcohol is fantastic to use to clean very locally, because 99% alcohol is very, very good to use because it evaporates very quickly. It doesn't really leave a residue. So when you're cleaning a film from an archival point of view, you don't want to leave any sort of chemical residue, because in the long term, not really sure how that's going to affect the film in the long run. But for like commercial release prints that, you know, need to go, ultrasonic cleaning is fine. There's even you can use, I don't really know if it's really around anymore, but Echo was fine. You could use that as well as a type of film guard, film cleaner. Kodak has a film cleaner. It's just called film cleaner. It's mostly used for stills, but in a pinch, you can use that very locally on moving image film as well.
Hello, good afternoon. Please, I would like to know if during this process they had ever lost any film, important film, or any other films, and also if somebody has been seriously sick during these processes.
Have you ever lost an important film or film in the process? And have you ever gotten ill, or have any staff gotten ill handling film?
I'm very proud to say I've never lost a film. I'm very meticulous, so but films have been lost previously to me, unfortunately. But like I mentioned before, with the mold and the fungus, people can get ill and get sick with respiratory problems if they inhale those mold or fungus spores. They're not careful about it. Sometimes if you're working with heavily vinegar syndrome films and you're not in a very ventilated area or wearing a mask, sometimes those off-gassing odors can give you quite a bit of a headache. So I've walked out sometimes just having a bit of a headache. But you know, it's not something you get used to. It's just something you learn to take breaks. You know, you're not going to do an 8-hour marathon session with heavily vinegared film just to get through it. You just physically can't do it. You have to take breaks to get some fresh air, basically. So yeah, and then on the other side of that is, because nitrate is flammable, it also is very toxic when it burns. So because nitrate film it basically has to extinguish itself because it generates its own oxygen as it burns, which is why you can't put it out. The smoke coming off a nitrate fire is toxic, and if you inhale enough of it, actually you can succumb to that. And there has been instances where that has happened in the past.
Yes?
Hi, thanks for the lecture. I was just wondering, globally, because film is not being used as much as it used to be, it's a ripple effect where there's fewer laboratories and fewer manufacturers of film. In the heyday, there were multiple manufacturers of film: Kodak, Agfa, Fuji. And I'm just wondering, globally, Asian markets and things like that, who manufactures films nowadays, negative-wise, and laboratory-wise? Would you say there's still a fair amount of activity globally?
Globally, to a certain extent, yes. Asia is a huge film market, and they haven't really taken the transfer to digital as we have here in North America. and it's basically due to economics, right? So, and Kodak is still a key player in those markets. Kodak is still the key player in producing negative and print stocks, hands down, blanket. Even though AGFA is around and still manufacturing stock, Fuji, unfortunately, is no longer in the moving image area anymore. They still are on the still photography side. So, and there's a group in Italy who is trying to produce color reversal film, Feria film. So there's a need, but at the same time, we could have all the film stock in the world still being manufactured as it was in the heyday, but unfortunately, labs are closing left, right, and center. My lab, Nitrate Custom Lab, is actually the last lab in English-speaking Canada, and we're a small boutique lab. So the labs in North America and in Western Europe are dwindling, but they're still around and you can still get your stuff processed. So globally, it's about 50-50 due to economics, pretty much.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I'm wondering if you could give some suggestions to an independent filmmaker with no money, the best way to store their films archivally. If it's good to have it, if it's okay to have it in a metal canister, for example, or if it should be in plastic, if it should be sealed, if it's good to have silica packs, if it should be cold. A lot of the times there's nowhere to store these things except in basements. Rental for professional storage can cost hundreds of dollars per year, and I'm wondering if that's worthwhile. These types of questions. I've been told that it's not good to seal them in bags, for example. Just any questions about metal reels and things like that.
Okay, that's a very, very great question. So for storage of your films, if you don't have the luxury of using a film vault, a proper film vault, it's true. So to store your films, say at home, you don't want to store them in plastic bags because film is organic. It needs to breathe. Those off gases need to escape. And that goes for sealing cans, metal sealing cans. You don't want to use metal sealing cans. You don't want to put the film in anything where those gases cannot release and escape, because then you just create kind of like a macro and micro environment where the film just kind of sits in those gases, and it actually spurs and accelerates deterioration faster, especially vinegar syndrome. Okay, so no plastic bags, no sealing cans. Kodak does manufacture metal galvanized, not galvanized, they're specially coated that are not sealing. That's an option, that's fantastic. There's also plastic cans that you can purchase that are non-sealing and actually have ridges on the bottom, so the film actually sits up just a tiny bit onto, so it's not sitting flat, so it's up a little bit so it can generate some airflow throughout the reel. Also, if you're storing your films and you're not accessing them very often, you want to store your films laying flat rather than vertically on reels, because you want to store them on cores and flat rather than vertically and on reels, because if you're not accessing it very often, what that creates over time is pressure due to gravity. Pressure on the top part of the film is it's going to compact over time, and then also on a reel, because say if it's in your basement, even if you've got really nice stable temperature, relative humidity conditions, films breathe, right? So with cold, they contract. If it gets a little bit warmer, they expand. And so sometimes if it's stored on a reel, that film has to go somewhere. And if it needs to expand past those metal reels, you can get popping issues where pop strands pop up, and then you can create some damage to your edges of your film. Sometimes it'll kind of curl and buckle the perforations over a little bit. So that's one thing you can try to avoid as well, is storing them on cores and in non-sealing cans. Does that help?
I actually was going to ask you, we have a lot of students and faculty and filmmakers in the audience, if you could maybe point to some pamphlets or online resources like, Rick Prelinger's book or other kinds of references of handling that perhaps people could also continue reading about it. This was a fantastic talk. If there are other resources that you would point to for our audience to continue researching how to store, how to know about different gauges, how to know about chemical and mechanical damage, and how to project, because a lot of people here might have projectors, to know how to actually do some more research.
You can reference us. Actually, the library has a lot of that information, and we could, I think what we will do is on our Learning Hub, the Higher Learning Hub, we will post a bibliography for you of references, if that will be helpful.
Yes, and so in conjunction with that, specifically, you can go check out Rick Prelinger's information as well, but there's also NFPF, Film Preservation Foundation, and they have online, they have a film preservation guide that's available in PDF format that is spectacular. I have 2 copies at home, just by the by, and so that's a great point as well. And they also, in that guide is also case studies. So a small archive, we came across this, and this is how we dealt with it, and so techniques and stuff like that as well. So there you go.
You mentioned 88 film. Where do we find it? Who's going to process it?
We'll process it for you, no problem. You can find it, actually, you can find it from Lift here in town, Liaison of Independent Toronto Filmmakers. They have it. You can order it. It's Whitner Chrome, so you can, which is basically AGFA stock. You can, so you can find it around. You can buy it online. You can buy it up at Lift. We currently don't sell 88. We sell Super 8, but you can find it around, and a lot of people use it.
So it's just 16mm stock, and you're going to develop and then slit it?
Basically, yeah. So it's 16 mil gauge, and it has the perforations of 8mm on the side, so 16mm size perforations. And then you shoot it. When you shoot it, you shoot down one side, and when you're done, you flip the spool, and you shoot down the other side, and you send it to us for processing. We process it as we would process any other type of film stock. It mostly comes in a reversal stock, so black and white reversal. And we'll slit it for you if you want, just slit it straight down the middle. But some people, surprisingly, don't want it slit. They want to use it for like a dual projection sort of effect. Fantastic. So it can be slit, it can be transferred unslit, it can be transferred slit. It's actually, I'm very happy to see that it's gaining steam and making a comeback.
I think we have a Twitter question.
Is it on? Okay. The question involves, what are the various stages to restoring a film?
Yes, indeed. Restoring a film. So the stages, every film's different, basically. It's a case by case. So there could be maybe to 1 or 2 stages if you're just needing to incorporate, say, some found footage, a lost scene, something like that. Or it could be multi-year, multi-layer process where you basically, the starting point for restoring a film is basically seeing that if it's been restored previously, because If it's been restored previously, then why duplicate that work when you can allocate those funds to another film that might need restoring? So multiple stages or not.
Hi, you've talked a lot about image, which has been fantastic, but I was wondering about restoring sound. I've done a little bit of research on this, and it seems like a lot of films are replacing, like more recent films, like films from the 80s, are replacing soundtracks with digital soundtracks. Like Dolby Stereo is being replaced with Dolby Digital. And I was just wondering if you've come across that at all, or anything with sound.
Well, sound is very interesting, as you've seen up there. Sound, when you start talking about the Dolby Digital Stereo versus Dolby, whichever surround sound, 5.1, whichever, they're all very proprietary, right? So as archivists, it's kind of a tricky, murky area because you start possibly stepping on, you're getting into quirky waters, shall we say. But there's just a progression to sound, right? As you saw up there, I know I'm probably not going to answer this as clearly and as thoroughly as you would like, and I apologize for that. But preservation of sound is very, very critical. So is your question more geared towards, we got to preserve, so it started as like a surround sound from like the early 90s, and then so because as archivists we try and preserve how the film was originally seen by the original audiences, how we're going to preserve that Dolby Digital. Is that kind of where you're trying to get? Oh, okay.
I study soundtracks, and so I'm getting frustrated seeing soundtracks restored and replaced because I'm not able to really see what was originally intended because they're being reconstructed a lot of the times. I know with some of the Cinerama films and those films are being cleaned up at Chase Audio when being put on DVD, and so it's making it very difficult as a historian to do our work.
Yes, because basically you would need to see the original film, say, with its stereophonic sound, right? Rather than after it gets done at the audio houses on digital, and that can be a challenge. But it's a challenge for the image as well, right? I mean, we've got, say, an image from the 1920s, and when we see it released out on DVD, it's cleaned up and it's immaculate and it almost looks static, and you're just like, really? Where's the texture to that? Where's those? So for soundtracks, it's almost like it's too clean, almost to that point. Where's the pops? Where's the clicks? Where's a little bit of noise, right? That we're kind of used to hearing. I saw, just to kind of dovetail, I recently saw a recently restored Warner Brothers cartoon, and the audio was spectacular. It was clean. It was like just crisp. There was no noise. There was no nothing. There was no modulation. Well, there was modulation, but there was just like voice inflections were just, it's like, what happened to the gravelly voice of, my character that I love? Now he's very flat, very fantastic, So I understand completely, but it is frustrating and it is part of the process. So that's how we are today, basically.
Any other questions? Before we wrap up, I want to mention we're going to have a fabulous exhibit on the fourth floor in the fourth floor gallery for Contact. Is Laurel here? Laurel, do you want to talk a little bit about that? I think it relates well to this.
It does relate very well. We have some upcoming free exhibition programming that is themed on 35mm film. So as part of Contact, opening April 10th, we have an exhibition of photographs by Rainer Reidler, who went into the archives of the Deutsche Kinemathek in Berlin and photographed film reels, positive and negative print, and they're really, really beautiful. So it's really seeing film in a new light, in a new way. And then in the summer, we have a free program of contemporary artists who in the main gallery downstairs, opening June 12th, of artists who are working with 35mm film. So we're really, really excited about that as well. So please come.
Thank you. So I want to thank Christina. You can see her passion here, and I think it's very interesting that she talked about using the 5 senses. I know certainly smell is always a big issue, but I love hearing her talk about the actual handling and the thickness of the film. To me, you know, she's kind of got me all excited now again about let's touch some film. But it's really fascinating to me, and also, you know, how much experience she has. It's almost like to me, it's almost like a mystery when you're looking at something like this and trying to determine what that experience was really like by taking this piece of film and going backwards through its history. So I think it's just wonderful, and I'm sure it takes years and years to really get that, what I would call a touch, or that ability. So I think it's just marvelous. I hope you've enjoyed this session. I hope you'll join us again for our next Real Heritage series session. And I really want to thank Christina. I know she's going to be here a bit longer today, working with some of the staff. So we're very, very excited. And this will all be up on the Learning Hub. And there will also be her workshop, which will be free for everybody to watch online, onto actually handling the film itself. So I think that's going to be very interesting, and I hope of use to smaller archives. It's very hard to get this kind of specialized training. A lot of people hold film in their collections, and it tends to get short shrift for that reason. So I think this will be a great asset to archives out there and anybody who has to handle film. So thank you so much.